Hello, and welcome to the Poppy Trail. My name is Hugh Brewster, and I'll be your guide for this walking tour of historic Cobourg with a Remembrance Day theme. You could take this tour online, virtually, or you can walk it in person using our handy online Poppy Trail guide. Either way, you'll be able to experience and savor remarkable streetscapes and period architecture, and also discover some remarkable stories from Cobourg's wartime past. So, come walk our history. I'm standing beside Victoria Hall, one of Canada's most beautiful public buildings. This historic Palladian-style structure was opened on the 6th of September, 1860, by the 18-year-old Prince of Wales and named for his mother, Queen Victoria. That evening, the prince danced till 3 a.m. at a grand ball held upstairs in the concert room. The prince, who later became King Edward VII, died in 1910, and his funeral is often seen as a prologue to World War I, since his son, King George V, and his nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II, walked behind his coffin. 4 years later, they would be at war. During the war, the concert room in Victoria Hall was the scene of many patriotic fundraisers. In fact, Cobourg during World War I raised more money for the war effort than any other Canadian town of its size. In 1928, the main floor courtroom was the scene of a landmark trial, a libel suit brought by General Sir Arthur Currie that effectively put World War I on trial. In 2018, the Northumberland Players recreated this epic courtroom battle in a play entitled Last Day, Last Hour, Canada's Great War on Trial. This imposing red brick and stone building once housed the 40th Northumberland Regiment and the Canadian Garrison Artillery, and it was a recruitment center in 2 world wars. The letters ER, seen over the keystone above the doorway, stand for Eduardus Rex, since it was built in 1904 during the reign of King Edward VII. Thousands of soldiers passed through here during World War I and II, and a large part of the building was converted to dormitories. The large drill hall was the scene of Saturday night dances, which were popular with the young women of Cobourg. It was also later used for community events, such as the annual motor show. In 1968, the building was sold and became the town's main police station. Behind this storefront on King Street stands a beautiful Second Empire-style home that was built in 1874 by William Battelle, a local builder who later became a mayor of Cobourg. It once had stables, a coach house, and an elaborate fence in front. William Beattie, the minister of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, was a lodger here and then purchased the home after Battelle's death. When war broke out in 1914, Beattie enlisted as a chaplain of the 40th Regiment of the Cobourg Battalion. His letters from the front, sent to the local newspapers, comprise a remarkable chronicle of the war. In describing his first impression of the Western Front, he wrote, "Imagine trying to live for over a year in the trenches which you have seen workmen in Cobourg digging when laying sewers." After the war, Beattie moved to Ottawa, and in 1956, the house was converted to a Canadian Tire store, and the front addition has been a retail space ever since. Now a private school, This building was formerly the home of the Cobourg Collegiate. Many men from the town who served in World War I and II attended high school here. Built in 1902 in a style known as Edwardian Classical, the building features oversized Palladian-style windows on the second level. In 1935, a teacher named C. Gordon King joined the staff, and during World War II, he served overseas as a troop commander for the Cobourg 22nd Medium Battery, achieving the rank of lieutenant colonel. He became principal of the school in 1953, and when a new high school, CDCI East, was built in 1960, he supervised both schools for several years before retiring in 1972. He was always active in the life of the town, and the public library is today named the C. Gordon King Center in his honor. This modern-looking bungalow is actually a Victorian cottage that, around 1909 and 1910, was the home of the famed comic actress Beatrice Lillie. As a child, B. Lillie toured Ontario with her mother and sister Muriel in a musical act known as the Lillie Sisters. They moved to this house when B's mother became the choir director of St. Andrew's Church, and her sister Muriel became the organist. In 1914, Mrs. Lillie took the girls to London, England, where B soon found parts in musical revues. Within 10 years, she was acclaimed as the funniest woman in the world, performing songs by Noel Coward and Cole Porter in West End shows and on Broadway. Her marriage to an English baronet gave her the title of Lady Peel. And during World War II, she toured tirelessly, entertaining British troops. One night, when informed that her much-loved only son had been killed, she insisted on going on with the show, famously announcing, "I'll cry tomorrow." When growing up in this house during the 1920s and 30s, Fern Blodgett Sunde dreamed of a life at sea. When the war began in 1939, she heard there was a shortage of shipboard wireless operators and went to school and became Canada's first woman to achieve a second-class wireless operator's certificate. Her school received a request from a Norwegian merchant ship called the Mosedale that was stuck at the port of Montreal without a wireless operator. Fern applied for the job and got it, but we can imagine how stunned Captain Gurner Sunde of the Mosedale must have been when he saw that the F. Blodgett walking up his gangplank was a woman. The thought of a female wireless operator was unheard of in the merchant marine. Nonetheless, he needed a wireless operator. Fern came on board, lasted through her first crossing, which was a bit of a nightmare. She was seasick much of the time, and then went on to make a record 78 crossings. She was eventually awarded the Norwegian War Medal by King Haakon of Norway, and she married her captain Gurner Sunde and became Fern Blodgett Sunde. The Cobourg Museum Foundation has just erected a statue on the lakefront in honor of this heroine of the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. Also in this house in the 1940s lived the mother of Flight Officer Robert Leslie Edwards, who was the first RCAF officer to die in battle in 1940, in August of 1940, during the Battle of Britain. He was also Cobourg's first casualty of World War II. This red brick Italian-style house with its lively facade was home to 3 generations of the MacNachtan family, 3 of whom served as county clerks. Edmund A. MacNachtan, a Scottish immigrant, came to Cobourg in 1863 to take up that position and was succeeded by his son, Neil MacNachtan, in 1891. Neil was a crack marksman who became the commanding officer of the Cobourg garrison. When he collapsed and died in his office at Victoria Hall in 1928, he was succeeded by his son, Edmund L. MacNachtan, who had served in the Canadian Field Artillery during World War I. He enlisted in September of 1914 and returned home with the rank of captain in late June of 1919, having served a remarkable 4 years and 9 months on the Western Front. If you look up at the roof bracket of this picturesque Gothic villa, just below it you'll see the letter D, which stands for Dumble, the family who built the house and named it Dromore. Thomas Dumble emigrated here from Cornwall in the 1840s and eventually made a fortune building many of Cobourg's roads and bridges. A grandson of his who grew up in this house was named Wilfred Dumble, and he went to England as a young man, joined the Royal Navy's Corps of Engineers, and eventually became head of the London Omnibus Company. In 1915, he was invited by Winston Churchill to become part of a secret committee known as the Landships Committee, who were looking into building large wartime vehicles that could crush barbed wire and crash through trenches. Dumble was instrumental in the creation of the world's first tank, which was nicknamed Little Willie, and by 1918, tanks had become hugely effective weapons in war and played a large role in winning the war. At the end of World War I in the 1920s, Dumble came back to Cobourg, and he met a wealthy woman who owned one of the grand estates called The Lawn, which is at 245 King Street East. And he married her and spent the rest of his life in Cobourg. This Romanesque revival basilica was designed by Peterborough architect John Belcher and completed in 1896. The Roman Catholic Church in Cobourg dates back to 1837, and many of its first parishioners were Irish immigrants who had fled the potato famine. A descendant of one of those families was Father Francis P. Duffy, who became a famous chaplain in the U.S. Army during World War I. Born in Cobourg on May 2, 1871, Duffy graduated from St. Michael's College in Toronto and then moved to New York City to teach at St. Francis Xavier College. As the chaplain for New York's 69th Regiment, Duffy became the most decorated U.S. cleric for his actions in battle and is celebrated in the movie The Fighting 69th, starring James Cagney. A statue of him stands in Duffy Square at the north end of Times Square in Manhattan. The elegant Greek Revival building behind me was once home to Victoria College, one of Canada's first degree-granting institutions. In 1884, it was granted full university status, but only 8 years after that, it amalgamated with the University of Toronto, and its campus moved there, a great blow to the town of Cobourg. The building then became a mental care facility for women, housing 150 patients. And during World War I, in 1917, it became a military hospital, caring for officers suffering from shell shock. Shell shock was something not much understood at the time. It's something we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The therapies given at the hospital here ranged from counseling and occupational therapy to electric shocks. As the men improved, they could take up carpentry or gardening, and volunteers from the town came regularly and helped out with the soldiers, and many strong bonds were formed with people in the town. In 1920, when the hospital closed, the military hospital closed, it once again became a mental care facility for women, and today it is a seniors' residence. This well-proportioned Victorian house was built in 1859 for Andrew Hewson, an Irish immigrant who operated a successful dry goods and millinery store in town. He and his wife had 6 children, and their daughter Charlotte and her husband, Deputy Sheriff David MacNachtan, lived with them for many years. Their only son, Edmund Hewson MacNachtan, was killed at Bouilly-Grenay, France, while serving with the Cobourg Heavy Battery. On August 9, 1918, an enemy shell hit a storage shed containing 9 artillery shells and 5 tons of cordite. A 9.2 howitzer gun was destroyed, and 26-year-old MacNachtan and 2 other Cobourg young men were killed. This handsome Victorian house behind me has been home to the rectors of St. Peter's Anglican Church in Cobourg for over 140 years. During World War II, the Reverend Robert Seaborn of St. Peter's went overseas as chaplain to the 1st Battalion of the Canadian Scottish Regiment. In June of 1944, he waded ashore with the regiment during the D-Day landings and was later awarded the Military Cross for carrying wounded men to safety. He's pictured in one of the most famous Canadian photographs of World War II, praying over a dying soldier outside Caen on July 15, 1944. A very remarkable photograph. After the war, Reverend Seaborn became the Dean of Quebec, then Bishop of Newfoundland, was also the Chancellor at U of T's Trinity College, before he retired to Cobourg, where he eventually died in 1993. An Anglican church has stood on this site since 1820. The facade and tower of the present church date from 1844, but the rest of the structure has been altered over time. The church once had a spire, which was taken down in the 1920s, and the turreted square tower that is there today was dedicated to the men of the parish who had served in World War I. St. Peter's was the regimental church for the 40th Northumberland Regiment and the Canadian Garrison Artillery, and the colors for both are framed inside the sanctuary. On November 7th, 1976, a service was held in this church for Canadian winners of the Victoria Cross and George Cross, the 2 highest awards for gallantry in the Commonwealth. 2 of the organizers were Cobourg residents and Victoria Cross medalists. One was Charles Rutherford, who had persuaded 50 German soldiers to surrender to him in 1918. The other was Chaplain John Weir Foote, who had rescued men on the beach at Dieppe in August 1942. I'm standing by these handsome stone gates that lead into Victoria Park in Cobourg. They were installed in 1948 by the Women's Professional Club of Cobourg to honor the men from Cobourg who died during World War II. Inscribed in stone here are the names of 39 of them, and their sacrifice forms a full picture of all the campaigns of World War II. Let's take Johnny Bolster, for example, who was only 29 when he died on the first day of D-Day, going ashore on Juno Beach, June 6, 1944. Just below him is Ralph Brown, who was only 20 when he died in the brutal slog up the boot of Italy during the fierce Allied campaign to retake Italy. Then we have Robert Edwards, who was the first pilot to die, the first Canadian pilot to die in the Battle of Britain in 1940. One of 8 young men from Cobourg who served as pilots with the RCAF. Then we have Gerald Gallagher, who was 31, and also Fred Lonsbury, who was only 21, both of whom died serving with the Royal Canadian Navy during the all-important Battle of the Atlantic. Then we have George Medhurst, whose nickname was Shorty, one of 2 men from Cobourg who served with the Royal Rifles in Hong Kong. When Hong Kong was overrun by the Japanese, George was interned in a prisoner of war camp and died there in August of 1943. On the other side of the memorial gates are inscribed some famous lines from Lawrence Binyon's unforgettable poem, For the Fallen, often recited at Remembrance Day services. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. In 1920, the local chapter of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire began fundraising for a Cobourg cenotaph. In 1924, it was unveiled by Effie Bolster, a Cobourg nurse who had served overseas, in a ceremony that was attended by thousands. The design of a Roman cross with a brass sword superimposed on either side was one created for the Commonwealth War Graves Association and used at war grave sites in France and Belgium. Emblazoned on the cenotaph is a quotation from a speech that Rudyard Kipling wrote for King George V to give when visiting war memorials. It ends with the words, "Sacrifice and honor are no vain things, but truths by which the world lives." A plaque on the monument remembers the Canadians who served in the Merchant Marine 1939 to 1945, known as the lifeline of the world. Another panel pays tribute to the Korean War 1950 to 53, in which 26,000 Canadians served and 516 lost their lives. Once the main hub of the town, this intersection was known as the Four Corners. It was here that a bonfire was lit during the victory celebrations on the night of November 11th, 1918, and the Kaiser in effigy was consigned to the flames. Similar scenes of revelry took place on VE Day, May 8th, 1945. On the southeast corner stood a very handsome classical revival stone building that housed the Bank of Montreal and was later the town's post office. Its height and beautiful design made it the perfect complement to Victoria Hall. Sadly, it was torn down in 1960 to make way for a Woolworth store. It was in the old Gem Theater, just east of the post office, that the Khaki Club, a recreation and assistance center for soldiers, was established by local women during World War I.